Welcome to the Kick Sugar Coach podcast. Join me each week as I interview experts who will share the science of sugar, sugar addiction, and different approaches to recovery. We hope to empower you with the information and inspiration, insights, and strategies you need to break up with sugar and fall in love with healthy whole foods so you can prevent and reverse chronic disease, lose weight, boost your mood and energy. Feel free to go to my website for details on my coaching programs and to access free resources, kicksugarcoach.com. Welcome, everybody, to this interview today with Jan Winhall. Let me read you her bio. Jan she's a master's of social work. And what does FOT stand for again?
Focusing Oriented Therapist.
Thank you. I should have guessed that. She's an author, a teacher, a seasoned trauma and addiction psychotherapist. She's an education partner and course developer with the Polyvagal Institute, where she teaches a certification course based on her book, Treating Trauma and Addiction with the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. I have my book upstairs, but let me tell you, it is a must read, which was published by Routledge in 2021. She's an adjunct lecturer at the University of Toronto and is a certifying co-coordinator with the International Focusing Institute. She is also co-director of the Borden Street Clinic, where she supervises graduate students. And she loves traveling and teaching and sharing her wisdom on the topic of trauma and addiction all around the world. Welcome, Jan.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
So I was just showing off what a good student I was of her book. So I have pages and pages and pages and pages of notes. It was a very unique book about addiction and trauma. It was really written from a therapist to therapists, but I think it would be relevant to anybody who's on the journey of trying to recover from both trauma and addiction, which are obviously, they very much coexist. And what made the book unique is that a large part of the book is actually sort of like a history of our understanding of what is addiction and how these different sort of points of view. She describes at one point in her book, like the blind men who have all got a piece of the elephant, and when they put it together, we have a big picture. And that's what Jan has done, is like she's brought all these different points of view, the brain disease model, maybe it's just trauma. You deal with the trauma and the addiction goes away. Not so quick, right? They're distinct and they require overlapping, but sometimes unique interventions. And so she's pulled all these different sort of theories and ways of understanding it and working with it into this model that sort of pulls it all together in this creative way that she calls the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. So we're going to explore that and unpack that today. So Jan, how did you get involved in this work? Let's start there. What drew you to the topic of trauma and addiction?
Well, probably how I grew up. I think it's true for so many of us. But what kind of crystallized it was when I finished grad school and I ended up getting a job in a hospital outside of Toronto in a pretty high needs area. And they had this program at the hospital for women who were incest survivors. And that's really how I got into all of this, because in running this group, I realized that a lot of these women were engaged in self-harming behaviors, which became addictive because they served a purpose. They helped them in sometimes ways they understood, like drinking, which would numb them, or some drugs, but in other ways that they didn't understand, like cutting the body, for example. They didn't understand why they were doing these things, or really interesting, like I couldn't understand things like sucking on bars of soap. What's that, right? So it was a journey really to try to figure that all out in a way that felt very respectful of the human body. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that is one of the paradoxes that you really explore deeply in the book, that the brain disease model comes up short in understanding that this isn't just a pathological brain problem, that this is a behavior that also is our best effort, or the individual's best effort, to try and regulate a dysregulated nervous system, it brings in a felt sense of safety, even if it is not ultimately in the end actually regulating. It's more dysregulating. It actually dysregulates the body as time goes on, even worse. But in the moment, it's helping. It is an act of self-care. It is their best effort to be kind and loving and good to themselves, even though, it seems bizarre.
Well, and I think from the model really, when you kind of distill it, it's really about two embodied processes. One of them is introception, the awareness of what's happening inside us in our body and also how we feel. And that's the felt sense piece of it that we can talk about. And then neuroception, Steve Porges' word for how our body unconsciously keeps us safe through the autonomic nervous system. And so what I put together over many years of trying to figure this out, and other people have too, but I hadn't found them when I did this. I found Judith Herman, actually, who she began to understand these behaviors through the autonomic nervous system. And so really what became clear was that, for example, when you cut the body, if you're in this kind of flight fight state, that's one branch of the nervous system, the sympathetic response of flight fight, that most of us know that feeling in the body. And if you drink a bottle of wine and then you shift down into a numbing place. But how did that work with cutting? Well, how it works with cutting is that if you cut the body releases these endogenous opioids. And so it numbs you. How amazing is that? It also works the other way. If you cut the body and you're in a numb state, it can trigger adrenaline and cortisol, which wakes you up and shifts you back into a flight-fight state in the nervous system. So we have these ways that help us to manage really dysregulated states in the body when we don't feel safe, when there's no opportunity to calm ourselves down in a way that feels safe inside. Then the body has these other systems to do that. Isn't that amazing? That's body wisdom. That is not pathology, in my view. It's actually very adaptive if you understand the context in which the behaviors are happening.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned in your book that addictive behaviors are adaptive strategies, and there's zero, when we really understand that for ourselves and for each other, that there's no room anymore for pathologizing, for shaming, for judging and punishing. These are people that are doing their best with what they had to work with to try and work with that pain.
Yeah, and I think actually addictions, they function as what we call state regulation strategies. They shift you from one state in the nervous system to another when there isn't the possibility of escape. And for lots of, certainly for the women that I was working with, there was no escape because these people that were hurting you were your parents. So how do bodies survive? Well, they have this amazing function of being able to help us to shut down. And it's kind of like hibernating. It's like you're living in the basement of your house. You're just surviving. It's not thriving at all, but you're surviving, right? Because how else could you survive something like that if you weren't able to dissociate and to numb the horror of it all? I mean, really, it's quite something the way bodies are designed. And we miss all of that when we just apply this kind of top-down pathologizing model that doesn't understand the true wisdom of the body and what we're gifted in that capacity to thank goodness to be able to numb and to dissociate and not even remember when it's really bad, right? Now, there's a problem with that, for sure. There's lots of problems with it, because bodies also get stuck in those neural pathways, those trauma, we call them trauma feedback loops. And then you're in trouble because you're still using when you don't have to anymore. when you've managed to get yourself to a place where it's safe enough that you could be more present. But because of the way brains work and neuroplasticity in the brain is carrying on, walking down the same pathway it has for many, many, many years. And so we get stuck in these old bad habits that are sometimes terrible. You know, this model is not about minimizing the harm of addiction. It's about understanding the true nature of addiction.
Mm-hmm. And the biggest
Our job, right? That's our job then as therapists and coaches, body workers and mental health workers, is to help people shift out of that state of the trauma feedback loop by helping them to understand if they can bring enough presence and safety into the body. And we know that's not easy these days.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I remember writing down that you had a quote here somewhere. It was something like, well, basically, about neurons that fire together and the whole, all the different research, the brain studies that really helped us understand that the brain is neuroplastic till the day we die, that it can be rewired, but that with brains like ours who started our addictions, especially, the younger, the more decades of use of wiring, the hard wiring of pathways, but that it's always possible. It's always
possible. I think you're talking about the plastic paradox.
Mm-hmm.
This is so interesting. This is Mark Lewis's work and Norman Doidge and this learning model of addiction. So I when I made the model, I was building it. I'm thinking, well, if it's not a brain disease, what is it? Like, how do we understand what this thing is that takes over in people? And so brains are constantly changing. So that's not a way of sort of justifying that it's a disease. Your brains are always changing and learning new things, right? But what happens is if you travel it's like if you think of a path in a forest, if you travel down that same path over and over and over again, eventually, you can see it very clearly. And if you think of it as a kind of it develops a muddy road, then you're in a rut and you can't get out of it. So we have to come in with our interventions to help people to shift out of that rut. It's like getting your car unstuck and moving down a new, fresh pathway that connects you with the ventral branch of the vagus nerve, which is the part of us that, when we feel safe enough, this part of the vagus nerve is online. And this is the place of healing and growth and restoration in the body. It's above the diaphragm. The vagus nerve is this long cranial nerve, right? It runs from the base of your brain, the brain stem, right down through into your gut. And it's an amazing thing, really, when you think this is the nerve that watches to see how safe we are. And if we're not in a safe enough state, it will shift us into mobilizing and fight flight. And if we can't escape, like these young women in my group, it shifts us into what Steve Porges named the dorsal branch of the vagus, which is where we shut down and dissociate and give up and hibernate just to survive.
Mm-hmm. And how you describe that addiction basically is the bouncing between those two states. And that's primarily it. So we're jacked up, we're wired, we're stressed, we're in fight or flight, we're overworking, we're in conflict, we're defensive, we're in a solitary defense state because there's this constant internal sense of threat. And when we've lost hope that we can outrun this threat or outwork this threat or solve this threat, boom, we crash into the freeze response or the trauma response or the dorsal nervous system state. And then we're heavy and lethargic and depressed and hopeless and helpless. It's a very dark place. It's a dark pit. And then our addiction can we're there for a while until we will either use our addiction or cortisol and adrenaline to jack ourselves back up into a stress state of mobilization again till we can't do it anymore and we crash back into the trauma response. And that's what addiction is we go from those two states.
Yes, that's exactly how we understand it through the polyvagal lens. I call them propellers. that shift you. I'm a very visual person, so I had to kind of put it down on paper, and I made this graphic model. And you can see in the model where we shift back and forth between this flight, fight, and then shutting down, and then shutting down and back up to flight, fight, because there's no safety there or no perceived safety.
Right.
Yeah, that's important.
Yes, because you talk about in your book how trauma creates triggers, and triggers distort the present moment. And we can be led to perceive threats that aren't there. Can you talk to us a bit more about that?
Yeah, because, the way memory works, right, is that when we're really traumatized and we dissociate, memory isn't processed through the brain in the same way. And so these memories stay like little pools inside us. And memory in the body is very different, right? If you go down into the body, into working with the felt sense, we should talk some more about this, then the way that your body remembers things is very different. It's not linear. So when a trigger happens, the memory feels like it's happening right now. It's right now, this is happening. And then up we go into these dysregulated states to try to manage those triggers that are really like they're unresolved trauma experiences that are kind of waiting and patiently for us to pay attention to them, to help people to heal. Yeah.
Right, because in our nervous system and in our cognitive mind, there's still a sense that that threat's still possible. It hasn't been resolved and cleared and let go of, right? It's still, there's still a perceived sense of
Trauma
again.
triggers us back to a wounded place. It's like a window into a wounded place in your life. And I try to help people to reframe triggers like that, because we can just hate them. It feels scary and horrible and whatever, and they do. But really, it's our body's way of saying, listen, there's this thing that happened, and it's getting in the way of us being fully who we can be, because it's a wound that needs attention, just like a physical wound needs attention.
Mm.
Yeah, physical pain in the body is a warning, right? It's like, oh, something's wrong here. It's not that it's our enemy, it's telling us something's wrong here. And triggers are like that too. They're emotionally painful, terrifying, chronic often, because they need to be paid attention to. So let's talk more about the felt sense.
That sounds great. You know what? I thought I would just share a quick slide in case we've kind of deep dived into the polyvagal and it might be new to somebody.
Okay.
And then what I'll do after I pull this one up, when we move into the felt sense and some of Jen Lynn's work, I'm going to try to find on the internet your model. I'm sure there's a slide there somewhere. I'll try and pull that up, but I'll share this quickly just in case it's helpful. So this is quite a classic sort of, it's one I created, but it's a very classic polyvagal sort of slide. So this is the traumatized nervous system. So in this window of tolerance here, this is where we have a flow, like we have energy that's activated. We've got a bit of a stress. I got to go let the dog out, or I got to make lunch or pick up the kids or whatever, right? There's a bit of a lift. I need to take an action. And then I come back down into, ooh, that's over. And I'm relaxed and present again. And all of this happens in the context of a sense of flow. I'm not overly stressed. I can handle everything that's coming at me, everything that's on my plate, all of the demands on my body and in my life. And I'm just flowing with my day. This is when you're in your window. But what happens is when something is too much, too fast, or it's a trigger, we move into this hyperarousal state, this sympathetic nervous system. I think of the sympathetic, S stands for stress, the stress state. And we can stay there for quite a long time. We can get stuck there. And then eventually it's just too much for too long and we crash into the dorsal. It's otherwise known as the freeze state or the trauma state. Same, all the same. And then we get stuck there for who knows how long. And then something sort of kicks us back into gear. Sometimes it's our addiction. We'll eat like chocolate, or like in my case, we use food a lot to sort of create these state shifts. And then boom, we're back into this stress state again. And we just keep kind of back and forth. We're not spending much time in this ventral flow, where we're connected and present in the moment to ourselves and to other people. So that's the polyvagal theories. Basically, there's 3 states: the ventral, the dorsal, and the sympathetic. And these are, very high level, but hopefully that'll be helpful. Is there anything you want to add about that before we move into
there's a couple of things. So the freeze state is actually, it's a little bit different. I know Steve called it that originally, but he likes us to be really specific about this. The freeze state is really a blended state of sympathetic and dorsal.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about that in your body, freezing has constriction in it.
Right.
But it's also immobilized, right? So the freeze state is what in my model I call fixate, because it is the place where addictions occur in shifting you back and forth between sympathetic and dorsal. The actual dorsal state is a collapse of muscles. And so it's a heaviness. There's no constriction. It's limp. It's the state of giving up and surrendering, right? So we, in the Polyvagal Institute, we want to really try to educate people around that, because it's kind of a shift in his way of talking about it, but it's important because it's important from the body's point of view. Constriction is not part of the dorsal vagus. You get that?
So constriction is sympathetic, and then when we drop into the freeze response, it's a heavy letting go. There's no tension anymore.
The freeze response is a blending of both. If you find my model,
Mm-hmm.
I'll show you.
I will.
Because the other piece I wanted to stress is that we have many blended states.
Yes.
In the nervous system, right?
Yes.
Totally. You just go on my website, or
I can make it.
That's the clinician version.
Do you want the simpler one?
Well, it's up to you. Is your audience mostly clinicians or no?
No, I think they're mostly people. I can pull up this one.
Go with the 6 Fs. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
There we go. So we made it into 6 Fs because my clients like simplicity, right?
Yes, yes.
The bottom yellow one we called flock, and this is the ventral branch of the vagus. This is the part of the body above the diaphragm up into the face. And this is the place where we feel safe enough. And where we really thrive and feel healthy. The immune system is working well. No, it's a great place to be. The other states are important too, though, because they're all good in the sense that they all help us, right? So then you see fight flight up there. That's the place of sympathetic that we all, we know that sense of either you want to fight to be able to respond to a threat, or you want to flight to get away from there in order to get out and to protect yourself. Then over on the other side, we called fold and collapse. This is the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve that Steve Porges named as part of the vagus. That's really one of the major contributions that he's made to this new way of understanding the autonomic nervous system.
Totally.
Then there are 3 blended states. People, we're working with different blends. There are more blends. This is just what I kind of come up with right now, but there are more, and more we're discovering. I think we really a lot of the time in blended states. So, but the one that we're talking about here, freeze and fixate, you see where freeze is?
Yeah.
So freeze is in between dorsal and sympathetic, because it has that constriction of sympathetic, right? But it also has the stuckness, the immobilizing force of the dorsal. So you're literally stuck. You're going nowhere fast. And that really is addiction. It's a stuck state, right? Really stuck in this awful place, this rut. It's even a rut in your neural pathways.
Right.
So I think it's a very helpful way of understanding, both the experience of what it feels like and literally what happens in the nervous system.
Right.
And the flow state is a blending of the grounded ventral branch and the part of the dorsal vagus, which is activated when we feel safe enough that we can be still. So we're not moving, which is the dorsal part of the vagus, but we're not moving and we feel safe. So in flow, we have meditation, we have a focusing practice where we go into the body and pay attention to what's happening inside. And then, whatever, maybe with prayer, where people are quietly reflecting. And then the other side is this blended state that we call fun or fired up. So fun is like when you're playing. So you've got some sympathetic energy in flight, fight, but you also feel safe. And kids, you can hear them in the schoolyard, they're laughing and having fun. And then as soon as something happens, you hear either they start crying and running home, they flight back to mom or dad, or they fight, right? Somebody hits somebody else because they feel threatened. And then fired up is a state of really feeling maybe adamant or passionate about something, or you're like right now I'm in fired up, or I'm sharing this with you and it's my work and I love it and it's exciting to share. And we're online, so people are watching and all of that. But I still feel, safe in my body and pretty grounded. So that's how we work with the nervous system in the Felt Sense Polyvagal Model. And my clients started like downloading this on their phone and sticking it on the fridge. All of the handouts are available on my website for people to download and to use. Yeah. So
right here at the center, and right here at the center is the felt sense. So we'll go there because this is
yeah. This was actually after I started working with these young women, I could see that there were lots of things going on in their bodies. And I was really curious. I started reading a lot of feminist research and literature, because feminists understood embodiment in a way that wasn't understood in a more traditional top-down pathologizing DSM model, which is what I was working in. And in the hospital, it was pretty terrible. I mean, the contempt that these women were treated with. They were diagnosed as having borderline personality disorder, and they were seen as being really manipulative, that a lot of these self-harming behaviors were about getting attention. Then when you realize that these self-harming behaviors actually are incredibly adaptive when you're not safe, I mean, come on. And this 40 years later, this is still like, bless her heart, Janina Fisher gets it. She's wonderful. And Judith Herman, but we still got this DSM thing with, all the ways that people are sick and screwed up and wanting attention and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I went hunting to try to figure out how can I help these wonderful young women to be more skillful with them, to help them understand what was going on in their bodies, because I didn't get all of that yet. I just knew something was going on there that we hadn't really tapped into. And so I discovered Gene Gendlin's work at the University of Chicago he was a student of Carl Rogers, who was a very famous, beautiful humanistic psychologist in the 50s and the 60s, 1950s and 60s. This is going back. I mean, Gendlin died several years ago and he was 90. But they were really curious about what produces change for people. And what they discovered was amazing. And it's really my model. So they discovered that people who were doing well in therapy, both reported by therapists and by their clients, they started recording the sessions, which is a lot of what happened in experiential therapy years ago. They would do these process recordings. And they found that during the sessions, there were these large gaps where nobody was talking. Can you imagine? And so they asked them, what were you doing there? And what they found basically was that these were clients who were pausing, a nice mindfulness strategy, right? They were pausing and connecting into how their body was reading what was happening in the session, this introceptive process. And so Jan said, well, okay, that makes sense, right? People that are doing well and able to make change in their life are integrated people. Their bodies and their minds are integrated. It's like a a loop that goes around instead of being cut off. And so he said, okay, if people are doing this naturally, connecting with this full experience of what's happening in their lives, which he called the felt sense, this kind of intuitive, deeper signaling from the body, something that the body knew that you didn't already know in your head. And we experience this all the time in life if we're connected to our bodies, right? Something will happen and we'll feel kind of a tightness in our throat or an upset stomach, and we're not sick. Something else is going on. And so that's the beginning of a felt sense. It's like your body's saying to you, wait a minute, something's not right here. And then, so Jan created these 6 steps to help people find the felt sense, to find the integration with body and mind. And then he invited people to come into partnerships. So we always focus in partnerships. In my courses on the Polyvagal Institute, everybody has a focusing partner. And you learn the process of paying attention to this interoceptive process of felt sensing, and also the neuroceptive process of where am I in my nervous system right now? And through that process, people really begin to understand themselves more deeply, to understand triggers more accurately, to process triggers, to live a more present, authentic life. And that's what we then teach clients in the model. So then I fell in love with Jan, really. I mean, he was a funny guy. He was a real character, but boy, did he know how to listen to people very deeply. You remember in my book, The Dream with Lata?
I do, very clearly.
Oh my goodness. When I saw that, I mean, I was lucky enough, it was over 30 years ago. I went to a conference that he was at in Niagara Falls in Canada with 30 people. There were only 30 people there. And he did this dream work with Lata. And I had never seen anybody be able to be with another person so deeply. The place where there's not words, really. The right hemisphere. The place of poetry, of imagery, of metaphor. This is the body. This is the body's language. It's not linear, right? And we've lost this. It's a tragedy. It really is. And it's what gets me fired up. Is like, if we don't get back to our bodies, we're going to destroy this world.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's easy to have, do damage to the climate and to each other when you're not connected to your body.
Right. And the irony is, and oh man, I wish I had some of these, my favorite quotes from your book, just right at my fingertips, but they're spread out among 60 pages of notes. But
I have them on Instagram. I'm putting quotes on Instagram.
I will share some of my favorites in case you're not pulling
it. We'll put them there. Yeah.
So when we work with addiction and trauma, page 158, we must remember that the autonomic nervous system is engaged in disconnecting from embodied experience. Addiction is a guard dog keeping deep feelings at bay. So we must work slowly and awaken ventral presence slowly. We help clients learn to titrate the experience of becoming embodied again, reconnecting to their body. The greatest source of healing lies in my client's capacity to engage with their felt sense, to access the healing power of the body. One last quote here. Clients learn how expanding their window of tolerance, their capacity to stay with challenging feelings, sensations, emotions, allows for a deepening of the felt sense experience. And for them, it is both reassuring and terrifying to know that the deepening of their capacity to feel into their life is the path forward. So the crazy thing is that we're using our addiction to shut down the overwhelming sensations in our body, the pain that's stored there, the overwhelm, the memories, or literally just the pain that the addiction itself has caused.
Yes.
Because right for my addiction, the food addiction, sugar addiction space, we wind up with metabolic syndrome.
Yes.
Left, right, and center in ever escalating amounts. We have fibromyalgia, we have migraines, we have cancer, we have diabetes, we're overweight. Like there's so much pain and trauma that our addiction itself is creating. And so we want to be less in our bodies the longer we're on the path of addiction. And so then when someone comes to the table to say, okay, the path forward, the path to healing is to feel, I mean, what? No, is there a plan B, please? Right?
Yeah. But you do that within the context of what I call the safe nest. So you do that within the context of co-regulation, we would say in polyvagal, of being with you in a way that inspires you to be closer to me, because it feels good. It awakens a part of us that's yearning for connection, because that's how we're designed. We're mammals. We're designed to connect with each other and to thrive when we're held and we feel safe and we feel warm and cozy, right? And so it's really about coaxing. It's hard work, coaxing and encouraging, and sometimes downright pulling people out from hiding in that cage at the back of the cage and saying, come on out here a little bit, because you were out here all on your own before, but now you're coming out here with me and with community. So I always work in groups pretty well. The only time I think individual work is good is when people are just not ready to go to group, and that's fine. There's a real place for it, and you can start there. But groups are magical, because in groups, the sense of connecting and intimacy is just magnified. And you learn from each other. You can see, oh, Joe Blow down there, he's a little further along than me. And look at him. He's having a good time. I want some of that, right? And so it just starts to grow and grow and grow. And in order for that to really happen, it's like you kind of have to help people kind of ignite into that energy, right? Of that ventral energy. It takes time. And sometimes it takes a long time in individual therapy to have that happen. And that's all fine. But my goal is to get them into group where you can really socially engage with other people. And this is the place where I think the place where I think 12-step has been really great in terms of offering this kind of group process and accessibility. There for everybody, almost all over the world, really, and all of that is great. It's just I don't think you need to buy the whole 12-step thing to have that. That's a thing we make on our own. We can build community, and we are in different ways, right?
Right. So if the thought of connecting to your body and the distress and the physical pain and the emotional distress that's there and the discomfort and the triggers, it just feels like, oh my gosh, thank you very much. I have an addiction because I don't want to feel that. I think what you're saying is that you don't have to do it alone anymore. Right?
You don't have to do it alone anymore, and also that we do it slowly.
Right.
So I think you were talking about the 3Ds that I write about in my book, Deepening the Process. Yeah, we do it slowly over time. And in terms of coming into the body, we do it very slowly. So there's a number of ways. Generally, the first step in focusing is called clearing space. And in that step, there's many different ways of being able to it's like a meditation step, really. And then it's not meditation anymore because you're going into a problem. And but it's a way of beginning to help people pause and slow things down and clear all of the noise that's in there, right? And the first way that I do in the beginning, I don't talk about that at all with people. I just get to know them. But then when we start to, through some kind of psychoeducation around what's important and what's going to bring you a good life, we can start by just saying, can you pause and notice what's in the room? Notice something in the room that you're drawn to. Like, I have lots of things in my room that I like, that I'm drawn to. We can teach people that too. Say, you could buy something that you really like, or find a rock or something that has meaning for you and put it beside you in your room. And then practice just noticing that for even 30 seconds, to slow down and stop. And so we have many ways of beginning that process of slowing down. We don't yank people. We go it's titrating very gently, very, very gently. Yeah.
Yes. And you do have a quote where you say, healing occurs in a series of daily practices that one intentionally commits to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. The daily practice is very important. You can't really rewire, I don't believe, without daily practice.
Right. The consistency, the slow.
Consistency. And that's hard, when we're used to a life of addiction, it's often pretty chaotic. But there can also be some very clear kind of structure there when it comes to meeting the needs of the addiction. So we kind of, piggyback on that. It's like, okay, so if every day you have this habit of doing whatever that numbs you, let's see if we can use that everyday thing, but change the habit.
Right. Instead of like that mid-afternoon chocolate bar and chips, right? Like, what? Go for a walk around the block. Take 10 minutes somewhere to just breathe, or put your hand on your chest.
Or even 1 minute to think about what you're intentionally committing to in your own life, how you want to really change your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or take 1 minute to bring up an experience that is really motivating you to change. I'm actually writing a workbook for my book.
Oh,
glad about, because it's much simpler. It's a Norton book, and it's coming out next year. I'm just writing it now.
Okay.
Boy, writing about establishing safety. Wow. I mean, it's always been tricky, but now with what's going on in the world, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of sense of threat. Environmental, political, economic. Like, Jan, I'm pretty immune to the price of food. I have been prioritizing it since I was in my 20s. I go into health food stores, and whatever they charge me, I pay, and I don't really blink an eye. Sometimes I wince and I move on because it's a priority. I don't have the option of the cheap stuff. It just doesn't work for me. And so, but when I'm at the till going, what? That tiny bag of Brussels sprouts is $13. I mean, wow, talk about. And then the interest rates and inflation, like post-COVID, is just like, if COVID wasn't difficult enough, like it's a lot on our nervous systems right now from so many angles. Yes. Yes. So one thing that was interesting in your book is that you talk about, let me just share this quote because I think it summarizes what you said, and then I'll move on to the part about harm reduction. You say, letting go of addictive behaviors that have helped us. They always help us. They're not sabotaging, self-hatred, intentional self-harm. It's not. They're always intended to try and help us. Letting go of addictive behaviors that have helped bring a feeling of safety triggers defensive systems in the body. So we must go slowly, honoring the role addictions play in creating stability and a sense of safety for the individual. So talk about an opportunity for self-compassion. That relapse is exactly those moments when you go, oh, I just have to go back to my safety. That's all it is. Right. It's just a matter of, I know that's really going to be comfortable and cozy and safe. And even if I know rationally, that's not a good decision to go back and eat the 3 rows of Oreos. Honestly, in that moment, that's all you're doing. And
Yeah,
just
and it's actually I believe it's an unconscious choice. It's just
totally.
the nervous system just goes to the place, it shifts states, and it comes from the brainstem. It's not a conscious thing. And the brainstem is not a sophisticated part of the brain. It's a part of the brain that just goes yes or no, kind of, yes. And so how the way that we work with relapse is we work with really harnessing the wisdom of the nervous system. And so being able to say, okay, so you came in, you're here today and you're really freaking out because you had 2 sips of wine. I've had clients like that. They get a sip of wine and they're terrified, which I understand.
Mm-hmm.
But then all this stuff starts going in. And then there's this whole thing about the 12 steps where you have to start again at day 1 and nothing of what you've done is mattered. And this, I have a very hard time. I do not agree with that. I think it's very damaging, actually, because it's not the way bodies work. You don't lose everything. The 12-step program really has to update itself in terms of neuroplasticity. And some people are. But, we know that you don't lose all you've gained. You don't. The brain, that you've still got that pathway in there that you've gained, but you lost yourself because you got triggered in some way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you can find what it is, and sometimes you can't. But we know too that when people can get back on track because they're not shaming themselves and they're not having to start all over again, they recognize, oh, my body went there because didn't feel okay. Those pathways of the ventral vagus are established and they can regain quite quickly, often. Not always.
If they have enough of a number of days, like they have had enough of a lived experience, I know what it feels like to let it go. And I know I felt safe there. That can feel safe too.
Yes. And also just neurophysiologically, your body has that pathway in there. It hasn't lost it.
Right.
But when people understand that, it's very hopeful.
Yes. And not that I want to overly defend the day 1 thing because it has traumatized me many times. It took me almost 2 years to get 90 days of back-to-back abstinence in my food addiction recovery program. I would break at day 13. I would have had a strawberry or I didn't finish my lunch. And then I'd break at day 27. I got all the way up to day 56 and I can't remember what I did. Whatever it was, I accidentally ate chicken instead of beef and I committed beef and I had to go back to day 1. Like it was so strict and so intense. Like I felt like I just was never going to get it. And then I broke at day 87. And in my program, you weren't allowed to talk in meetings. So you had 90 days of back-to-back. You couldn't go out and tell your story. And there was limitations to your capacity to be a full participant in. And so it was a big deal to get your 90 days. And it was so demoralizing.
Oh
And
my God.
oh yeah. It's one of the more
goodness.
extreme sort of, and yet in its defense, I do understand that when my sponsor said, honey, we're going to send you back to day 1 because I want you to experience the beauty of the day 1 surrender. That right. I was drifting off course and I was heading for the ditch and we're going to catch you and then just get you right back to the basics, right? Like just remember that you're falling asleep at the wheel a little bit here, right? So it was more in that context, but still, like your point's not lost on me. I lived it. Yeah.
I think it's wanting to revisit that real intentionality.
That's it.
Which is hard, and it is true. People lose it. They do.
You do.
What I think helps people to really hold on and sustain it.
Yeah.
Social engagement. It's precisely the opposite of what you were like. It's talking, sharing, being in connection with other human beings. And this is very polyvagal. It's like,
right.
We need each other to be able to really grow and thrive.
Right.
And the more you have these ventral experiences, the more the body builds this ventral state, and the easier it is to come back to it again.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really comforting to know that.
Right, right. There's nothing but hope. As hard as it is to walk the path of recovery, as hard as it is to rebuild neural pathways and extinguish ones that have been, with us for decades. And as easy as it is for us to jump on the bandwagon that there's something wrong with us, and that it's pathetic that we keep relapsing and we're doing these self-harming behaviors.
I think a lot of that is about, I think
But
it's a type of masculinity.
mm,
Because we live in a culture that lays a real trip on us as women, and also as men, and all genders, really, in terms of how kind of being independent really means not needing anybody else, this kind of fierce, hyper masculine story. And so the state of dependence is really like abhorrent in this culture. And what is addiction? It's a state of dependence. You need something in order to be okay and survive. You're in this chronic kind of childlike state of dependence. And for those of us living in this kind of really top-down Western hyper-masculine culture, that's a shameful place to be in and of itself.
mm-hmm. And the irony is that we're dependent on things, substances, behaviors, addictions. And we're not dependent on what we should be, which is interdependent with other people, that we're very isolated. We're hyper alone. When stuff really is painful and big and overwhelming, we isolate and we find Ben and Jerry.
Yeah, because the relationships have hurt too much. They've let you down.
They feel unsafe.
Yeah.
Unreliable.
Find the thing that works.
Yep.
That's survival. And then people shame you for it. It's ridiculous.
Right. Right. And the fear and the journeying through, learning to not fear the fear of being, to co-regulate, to connect with somebody who will lend you their nervous system. They can look you in the eye, put a hand on your shoulder and say, I'm right here and you're not alone and you're going to be okay, right? When we don't know how, we don't have people in our world, our inner world, or we don't know how to lean into them and to take that in, we're going to use substances. But the path of recovery is to restore our capacity to do that for ourselves and with other people, and to let go of the substances. In your book,
too, though.
I'm so sorry.
People too. We can be addicted to people too.
Oh, good point.
Right. That it's a relationship, but it's not a ventral vagus socially engaged relationship.
Right.
It's a flowing back and forth with presence.
Right.
Yeah. And that's I think the behavioral addictions are really important to see in the same way. They work in the same way in the nervous system.
Oh gosh, that's such a good point. Right. That was not one of my addictions, but it did come up in your book. And that's a good reminder that, right, people can get really pathologically codependent. I'm not pathologically, sorry. Let me delete that word. They can be really codependent in a way that borderlines, if not is full on addiction, that there is this dependency on somebody else to feel okay.
The real trauma bond, it's a full on addiction.
Interesting.
Just as real as the other ones. They work exactly the same way in the nervous system. And they can be absolutely terrifying. In fact, I shared in my book, that was my addiction early on in my
You just briefly mentioned it. It was just like one little sentence.
Well, I mentioned running down the street in Bracebridge and like panicking at the thought of losing this boy I was connected to. But it gave me a real window into understanding what that is. It's like you feel like you're going to die without this person.
Wow.
Terrifying.
Wow. Right. In your book, you say, essential to recovery is knowing that they can recover thanks to neuroplasticity. Do you want to speak more about that?
Well, it's very hopeful to understand that bodies are designed to help us to survive, and that really everything that we do comes from that place of seeking safety and survival. And so it's very hopeful to know that if you stick with your daily practices, brains can change and they can heal, and you keep growing these new pathways, and you can live a life where you don't have to be afraid all the time, because you know that as long as you're following your embodied practices, you'll be okay. And that's very hopeful. Yeah, but this is how the body is designed, to help us to survive. It's not our enemy.
Right. And our titration of connecting to our body and being able to feel our feelings, and then maybe distract ourselves or disassociate. It's okay. That's part of the journey. It's in, it's out. It's in, it's out. Maybe a little bit longer in, a little bit less time out, right? That's the journey, that we all relapse, we all slip, we all run home.
And that we need to sometimes. If we feel threatened, we need to. I mean, what I always go back to is how could these young women I was helping, and they were helping me to learn, ever have survived being raped by your dad?
No.
You can't.
No.
I mean, you do, but the way you do is through body wisdom. It's through the dorsal vagus. It's
Yeah.
through shutting down and numbing and not remembering and dissociating. This is a gift from the body. It is not a disorder. It is a gift from the body. And it becomes a problem. Absolutely. The very thing that kept you safe becomes the very thing you have to let go of to heal. That's the paradox, right? What helps you harms you. And that is very hard for people to understand. But when you get it, you get it. And there's a lot of cognitive stuff in this too, in the model. It's psychoeducational, big time.
Yes.
Understanding how the neurophysiology of how bodies work. And it's not like I'm no neuroscientist, but you can learn the basics.
Yes.
To make sense out of it, right? And that's what I tried to do in the book, is to distill some of that information so that we could make sense out of it, because it's complicated, right?
So as we wrap up, I'll just do a little bit of a high level summary, and then I'd love to invite you to any final words you'd like to share. So what we've heard today is that there's different ways of understanding addiction. What Jan has done so well is she's taken the felt sense work of Dr. Genlin. Was he a doctor? He was a doctor. Yeah.
He was a philosopher and a psychologist. Yeah.
Okay. And he what he observed in his psychotherapy practice is that the people that recovered, that truly found recovery through the journey of psychotherapy, was doing something that was very interesting to him at first, is that they were pausing to sort of process something that they were working on in the therapy sessions. And he wondered, what was that pause? What were they doing in that pause? And he realized that what they were doing is that they were connecting in with the body, and the body was processing. The mind and the body were working together to process what was happening in the therapy. And that led to a felt shift. And the felt shift is what creates change. I wish I could find this quote. I was trying to, without trying to make a big ruckus with my notes. I might be able to go off the top of my head, but basically it's like this. Insight does not create behavior change. Does not. What does is the felt shift. It's this experience that we probably all have when something shifts in our body and we just know we're in a different place. Something
the place that I put together, the felt shift, is a place, it's an autonomic state shift in the body.
Yes.
So when you feel this, oh, now I get why I said what I said to Joe Blow. Now I understand what I was doing. We all know that place. That's a felt shift. It's like you've shifted from this tension, you don't get it, to like, okay, now I understand why I did what I did.
Mm-hmm.
That's a felt shift. And that felt shift is shifting us in the body from, I believe, from say a sympathetic state of discomfort into a ventral state of
Mm.
And Gendlin saw that. He saw this physical release in the body, and he actually did 3 studies of the autonomic nervous system.
Right.
They were simple, and he didn't continue because he was a philosopher. He created a philosophy called a process model.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the model is. That's my thesis that I put together, that I ran by Steve Porges. I said, I think these felt shifts we talk about in focusing, they're state shifts, right? And he's like, yeah, absolutely.
Totally.
Yeah. And when you get it, you really get it, right?
And so the whole journey of recovery, so there's the felt shift sense that Eugene Gendlin observed, that he knew that's what was creating the behavior change. Psychoeducation insights, great. That's the mind piece. But until it connects to the body and something shifts and you drop out of this activated state or the freeze response or the fixated response and back into the ventral where you are connected, you are integrated, you are present.
And you're not addicted. In that state,
right.
Addiction does not occur.
Right.
And that's very hopeful. The more time you can spend in a grounded ventral state where the body feels safe enough, addictions don't happen there.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So the path home, so we've got felt sense, connecting up with the polyvagal, which understands that there are 3 states of the nervous system. And in 2 of those states, the hyperarousal and the hypoarousal, anything outside of the ventral, where we're present to our bodies, connected to our emotions and other people and in the moment. If we're not in there, we're in a higher or the crash state. We are in the addiction realm of addictions, right? But when we come home to our body, to an integrated state, to the present moment, to self-regulation and co-regulation, our addictions are no longer needed. So that's the journey of recovery. And Jan was saying it's slow and it's gentle. And when we bring compassion and understanding to it, we can see that our addiction is just always only ever been there to serve us, to support us, to help us feel safe. And now that we can see what's happening, the path forward can feel less frustrating and less shameful. There's nothing shameful about this. We needed those then, and now we don't need them. And now we start the journey of letting them go so that we can find other ways of living in the world in a safe and embodied and an alive kind of way. Anything you would add to that, or any final words you'd like to say today?
We didn't talk about what we actually do in the 4 circle practice. So maybe you'll have me back.
I'll have you back, because we didn't talk about the 3 circles at all. And I thought about going there and I thought, no, because we haven't even touched on the 3 circles. But another to be continued. When Jan has her workbook out, we will have her back and we will all buy her book, because this is amazing. This is just
for people to know. You can download the 4 circles on my website.
Okay.
But to know that in that model, that 4 circle model, it's a map that helps you bring together focusing and polyvagal theory in a very simple behavioral pragmatic way to work through the model.
Jan, can you give people your website?
janwinhall.com.
Too easy. Thanks everybody for tuning in today. Thank you so much for your time today, Jan.
Thanks so much. That was really fun.
Thanks for tuning in this week. If you would like more interviews, more information, and more inspiration on how to break up with sugar, go to my YouTube channel, Kick Sugar Coach, or my website, kicksugarcoach.com. See you next week.